Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the summer term virtual Ada Benson Lecture, named after the very first headmistress of Oxford High School. I'm Claire Chipchase, Deputy Director of Sixth Form, and I'm delighted to be welcoming Tim Harford to speak to us all this evening on how to start a revolution with a pie chart. Described by the New Statesman as perhaps the best popular economics writer in the world, Tim needs little introduction. Many of us are familiar with the BBC radio shows More or Less and How to Vaccinate the World, as well as Tim's recent fascinating Cautionary Tales podcast. Author of 9 books, his most recent, How to Make the World Add Up, is out this week in paperback. It provides us with a set of rules to enable us to make sense of numbers and statistics. And in the words of the fabulous Stephen Fry, every politician and journalist should be made to read this book. Tim has a golden rule: be curious and ask questions, and there will be plenty of opportunity to do this after his talk. Please use the chat function, selecting the Send to Everyone option. Tim, thank you so much for giving up your time, and we're delighted you can be with us this evening.
Thank you so much. On the Asian side of the Bosphorus in Istanbul, there's a huge building called the Scutari Barracks Hospital. The Scutari was the largest barracks in the world when it was built in the early 1800s. But by the 1850s, it was to become the world's largest hospital. And observing the Scutari Barracks from the deck of a ship as she sailed into Istanbul, Florence Nightingale reflected on the magnificence of the buildings. But she said that in retrospect, with some hindsight, they were whited sepulchres, pest houses. The Scutari Barracks Hospital was to see the site of a humanitarian catastrophe in the 1850s. And Florence Nightingale, still, I think, the most famous nurse in the world, was there witnessing it firsthand, in charge of the nursing, not only in the barracks hospital, but in other hospitals in Istanbul. She and her nurses were supposed to be taking care of British soldiers coming back from the front of the Crimean War, needing urgent medical attention, which Nightingale and her team of nurses were often very ill-equipped to provide. She wrote to a friend back in Britain, "Oh, you gentlemen of England can have little idea from reading the newspapers of the horror and misery in a military hospital of operating upon these dying and exhausted men, that this is the kingdom of hell, no one can doubt." It was a disaster. Over that winter of December 1854, January, February 1855, infectious diseases tore the British Army to shreds. Nightingale did what she could, but she was poorly equipped. She didn't fully understand what was happening or why it was happening. There was no germ theory at the time. And of course, the logistics division, the quartermasters of the British Army, seemed to delight in refusing to deal with Nightingale, a woman in a man's world. She wrote another one of her letters, this time complaining: no mops, no plates, no wooden trays, no slippers, no shoe brushes, no blacking, no knives and forks, no spoons, no scissors for cutting the men's hair, which is literally alive, no basins, no toweling, no chloride of lime. She never forgot the sights that she saw that winter. But while the reputation of the generals and the politicians was slowly ebbing away, there was one individual whose reputation continued throughout the disaster of the Crimean War. That individual, of course, was Florence Nightingale. She became viewed as almost a saintly figure. Throughout the media, the press, back home, people worshipped Florence Nightingale, easily the most famous woman in Victorian Britain, other than Queen Victoria herself. And the soldiers loved her too. One soldier wrote of the glory of seeing Florence Nightingale herself moving through these hordes of great rough soldiers and imagining what would happen if one of them were to insult her, wouldn't give a penny for his chance. Every man there would stand up for Florence Nightingale. By May of 1855, things had improved sufficiently that Florence Nightingale was actually able to visit the battlefront near Balaclava and see the massed ranks of the British Army give 3 cheers for Florence Nightingale. But shortly after she arrived in the Crimean Peninsula, disaster struck again. Florence Nightingale collapsed, suffering a severe fever from an unknown illness. And pretty soon, the rumours went around the British Army. Florence Nightingale was dying. So why am I telling you a story about a Victorian nurse? Partly, I think, because Nightingale was such a fascinating person, somebody who achieved amazing things. Partly because she was, and I mean this in a very sincere, complimentary way, a massive geek. And I'm interested in massive geeks. It's partly also the weapons that she used to fight her battles. I suppose most fundamentally, I'm puzzled by the way that we think about Florence Nightingale. We worship her as though she had died young. She's like a sort of John Lennon figure, almost. It's as though she had died on the 13th of May, 1855, in Crimea at the age of 35, and never achieved anything else, just frozen in amber, that great icon of nursing. And that's very strange, because Florence Nightingale lived to the age of 90. And what she did in the second half of her life is, I think, far more interesting than what she achieved as a nurse in the Crimean War. We don't necessarily remember that, though. And we think of her as a nursing icon. When my mother died 25 years ago, she breathed her last breath in a Nightingale hospice. We named our emergency hospitals after Nightingale. They put her on the front cover of the big issue at the beginning of the pandemic, All Hail the Hand-Washing Queen. She's the only woman other than queens to be on the banknotes in the 20th century, but all celebrating her work as a nurse. And I want to celebrate her work as a statistician and as a communicator. So let's go back to 1855 and what Nightingale was dealing with, and not just during the war, but immediately afterwards. So in the spring of 1855, a sanitary commission arrived from the UK at Nightingale's request. Their job was to clean up the hospitals. And it turns out they had a lot of cleaning up to do. So they discovered little things such as the entire drainage system from the ground away from the hospital had been blocked. So effectively, the hospital was built not on a functioning sewer system, but on a cesspit. The sewage was leaking into the drinking water. In fact, one wing of the hospital, the supply of fresh water was blocked by a decomposing horse. I don't want to get all technical, but that's not a good thing to have in your water supply. And the Sanitary Commission discovered all of this, and they had the resources, the manpower, the time, the authority to do something about it. And Nightingale was delighted. She wrote one more of those letters, commenting that the Sanitary Commission is really doing something and has set to work burying dead dogs and whitewashing walls, 2 prolific causes of fever. She knew that the Sanitary Commission's work was vital, and she could see it in the data. So Nightingale had been fascinated by the data. Since she was a young girl, she'd go out into the garden, aged 8 or 9, and count all the different types of plants and animals she saw, and she'd plot bar charts of them. But in this case, when you plotted the data, you saw something really remarkable. You saw that deaths in the hospital were falling dramatically as the Sanitary Commission did its work and cleared away the dead horses and the dead dogs and sorted out the water supply. Unsurprisingly, you would think, to modern eyes, although, as I said, there was no germ theory, there was no clear idea of exactly what the problem was. But Nightingale observed the data, she observed what was happening, and she learned the lesson. And she was one of a group of what became known as sanitarians, who were absolutely convinced of the power of public hygiene to increase public health. When she returned from the Crimean War, she's a war hero. She got to meet Queen Victoria herself. Nightingale was not very impressed with Victoria. She said, she's the least self-reliant woman I have ever met. But she realized the Queen could be useful to her. So the Queen was persuaded to set up a royal commission into the health of the British Army. Now, Florence Nightingale, of course, couldn't sit on the royal commission that she had persuaded the Queen to set up, because Florence Nightingale's a woman, and can't possibly have women in positions of authority serving Queen Victoria. Anyway, she wasn't allowed to serve on the commission, but she worked behind the scenes. So she had a lot of powerful friends and allies who she would maneuver into position and try to make her case. Well, what case was she trying to make? Well, the case was simple enough, really. It's that just as the hospitals in Scutari had been cleaned up, hospitals in the UK needed to be cleaned up as well. And so did public housing, the slums. So did military barracks. All across Britain, in fact, all across the British Empire, people were dying unnecessarily because of poor hygiene and sanitation. That was the argument she wanted to make. And you'd think it was an obvious argument, but there's no Louis Pasteur, there's no Robert Koch, there's no germ theory. So there's no strong evidence that this is the case. Nightingale was trying to gather that evidence. She was doing so in the teeth of the opposition of the military and medical establishment. Remember, the Crimean War had been a complete catastrophe. They didn't want to go anywhere near it. They didn't want to learn any of the lessons. They didn't want to revisit it. It had just been a public humiliation. And they certainly didn't want this loudmouth woman, Florence Nightingale, telling them what to do. And so, for example, Sir John Simon, who was the chief medical officer of England in the 1850s, the predecessor of Chris Whitty, he said in 1858 that deaths from infectious diseases were highly prevalent. A lot of such deaths occurred. But he said that they were, practically speaking, unavoidable. So, and we've heard this sort of talk in the recent pandemic. The idea that there's really nothing you can do about the virus. You can't really prevent the spread. There's no treatment. Just take it on the chin. Toughen up. Get out there. We've heard that argument from a few people. And this was basically the argument that John Simon was making in 1858. There's nothing you can do. Yeah, people die. They die of cholera. They die of dysentery. They die of typhoid. What are you going to do? It's the British Army. They're supposed to be tough. Now, Nightingale found this absolutely infuriating. And she had a plan to defeat men such as John Simon. And what I find striking is the remarkably 21st century weapon she used to win the argument. So Nightingale was very explicit that she had the data to support her point, but data alone were not going to change things. The great Nobel Prize winning psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, says nobody ever changed their mind because of a number. They needed a story. Okay, Florence Nightingale was going to give them a story. So let's have a look at the Nightingale Rose diagram. And this is the story that Nightingale was trying to tell. I've seen this diagram up close in the library of the Royal Statistical Society, and it's really a absolutely remarkable object when you get to observe it in the flesh, so to speak, get you to run your hands across the pages. So this is the pie chart that was advertised when we invited you to come to the lecture. And what does it show? Well, the blue wedges, the pale blue-grey wedges, show deaths from infectious diseases. The black wedges are deaths from all other causes, so mostly accidents. And the pinky red wedges are deaths from wounds. And these graphs are built to operate kind of like a clock. So you read them around. So look first on the right-hand side, the bigger of the graphs. This is April 1854 to March 1855. This is the first year of the Crimean War. And what you see is July, August, September, deaths starting to grow. Not too bad in October. In November, that's when Florence Nightingale herself arrived in Istanbul. And then you just see the deaths really starting to grow. December, January 1855, February, they're so huge, they're threatening to spill off the pages and just overlap. They can't even be contained by the piece of paper. Then we move over to the second half of the diagram on the left, April 1855 to March 1856. You've got the same basic design. The story continues, April 1855, and the deaths are much smaller. And as the war continues, the deaths shrink away almost to nothing. This diagram is a story, and it's a story in two parts. Part one is catastrophe. Part two is recovery. Nightingale designed this graph. It's known as the Nightingale Rose, specifically to tell the story that she wanted to tell. What divides the two halves of the story? Well, the Sanitary Commission showing up from London, clearing dead horses out of the water supply. That's the argument Nightingale wanted to make. And she wanted to make the case that it wasn't just happening in the hospitals in Scutari. This would happen everywhere where public health was improved. She said nature has the same laws everywhere. So that's the argument she wanted to make. Let's remove the diagram for a second. What I think is really fascinating about this is the choice to have a diagram at all. So standard practice, the French had diagrams, but standard practice in the 1800s in the UK was not to use a diagram at all. If you had any data, put it in a table. Nightingale knew that this would not work. She actually wrote a comment to a statistician friend of hers saying, he presented the data in terms of a table, and he said, she said to him, well, presented like this, in double-columned table, I don't think anyone would read it. She said, none but scientific men even look into the appendices of a report. And this is for the vulgar public. Now, who is the vulgar public who is to have it? The Queen, Prince Albert, all the crown heads in Europe, to the ambassadors or ministers of each, all the commanding officers of the army, all the regimental surgeons and medical officers, the chief sanitarians in both houses of parliament, all the newspapers, reviews, and magazines. This is a communications strategy, a very deliberate one. She wrote a letter Christmas Day in the late 1850s to her friend, the former Minister of War, Sidney Herbert, explaining her strategy that she was going to have these diagrams glazed and framed and hung in the offices of the War Office, the Horse Guards Barracks, the Chief Medical Officer's office. This is what they do not know and did ought to. It's a very modern vision of communication. It's not enough to gather the numbers, to gather the evidence. It's not even enough to plot the numbers on a pretty graph. The pretty graph is going to tell exactly the story we want to tell, and I'm going to make sure that that graph is in front of everybody who needs to see it. In another of her letters, by the way, she commented that she thought that Queen Victoria would look at one of her reports because it has pictures. Now, she really understood her audience. So it's a remarkable communications effort. But I think it's also at the beginning of a certain number of problems that arise when we communicate with graphs. The thing is, our visual sense is incredibly potent. So when we say, oh, I see, we actually mean, oh, I understand. We're using the word, the verb to see as a direct synonym for the verb to understand. But of course, sometimes we see things and we think we understand, but we haven't understood at all. You only have to look at Twitter to see this in operation. So, for example, early on in the pandemic, an epidemiologist, Dr. Eric Fagel-Ding, who's got a large Twitter following and a very excitable, quick-fire style, he tweeted a graph from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with the comment, newsflash, young people are not immune. You are just as likely to be hospitalized as older people. Even the CDC says so. Wow, it's quite striking. And if you look at the graph that he tweeted, you notice something rather strange, which is that it doesn't actually portray the picture that he described at all. It was kind of confusing. The axes were all mixed up. Basically, you had one bar in the chart that showed everybody, I think, from 18 to 45. And then the next bar in the chart was 46 to 55. So you've got everybody under the age of 45, and then you've got just a 10-year slice of people. And those two bars look about the same, but of course, there's way more people in the all adults under 45 category. So sure, it's a confusing graph. Didn't portray reality in a straightforward way. But then again, Eric Fagel-Ding is an epidemiologist, and maybe he should have checked the small print. And when I say small print, I mean the x-axis. He's not the only person to make this mistake. A couple of days later, Ann Coulter, who's a right-wing pundit in the United States, tweeted out a graph announcing that COVID was less dangerous than flu for the under 50s. And again, if you look at the graph, you realize actually it shows the exact opposite of what she says. It shows that COVID is 5 times more dangerous than flu if you're in your 30s and 8 times more dangerous than flu if you're in your 40s. But you have to actually read the graph, and who has time for that? I mean, it seems almost as though we're making these incredibly rapid decisions. I mean, for Ann Coulter's graph, which by the way got 10,000 retweets, it would be the equivalent of showing a picture of a cat next to a cow and saying, you see, cows are smaller than cats. No, it's the absolute opposite of that. But to understand that it's the absolute opposite of that, you have to check the fine print. You have to check the data, the axes, to really understand what's going on. And we don't. There's research from Tufts University that finds that people form an impression of a graph within 500 milliseconds. That's half a second. And of course, in half a second, you can't read a graph. You don't even know what the graph's about. But you can say, oh, it's a mess, or ooh, shiny. And we form these impressions so rapidly. Give us 500 milliseconds alone with a pretty graph, and we are bowled over. Now, Florence Nightingale understood this. Florence Nightingale was trying to hijack the way that graphs persuade her. And thank goodness she did, because, well, she was right. The British Army did need to clean up its barracks, and the British Empire did need to clean up its hospitals, and public health needed to be improved. I mean, she was right about that. But then the graph, is that the way to convey the message? Let's have a look at the Rose diagram again. I mean, when you see it, it's a very beautiful graph, but it also can be extremely confusing. I mean, I had to talk through how this all worked, what all these wedges and slices really meant. There's an overwhelming impression that you get from the graph, which is of this two-part story. First, the hospitals are falling apart, everyone's dying. Second, the Sanitary Commission shows up and everything improves. Now, modern graphic designers, they argue about this graph. How good is it really? And a lot of people love it, but a lot of people don't. A lot of graphic designers will say, look, this is super complicated. It has all the disadvantages of pie charts. And let me tell you, graphic designers do not like pie charts. And wouldn't it be better if the whole thing was presented as a bar chart? Okay, well, that's a good idea. Let's have a look at the same data presented as a bar chart. Because when you see it, I think you may be surprised. It's the same data plotted by Nightingale's biographer, Hugh Small. And what's the first thing you notice? The first thing you notice is that before and after story. It's not really there in quite the same way. You see this big winter wave and it falls away quickly, but gradually. So February is better than January, March is better than February, April is better than March. Remember, the Sanitary Commission showed up in late March. Nightingale's biographer, Mark Bostridge, says that there's not much evidence that they could really have made a difference until April, possibly even until May. So when you look at this graph, what you say to yourself is, well, maybe it was the Sanitary Commission, maybe it was something else. Maybe it was winter, for example. Could just have been winter that was leading to the poor condition of all these soldiers. Another thing that doesn't come out in the data at all is that there were just more soldiers coming back from the front in Crimea over the winter. So come the spring, not only is the weather better, but the hospital's less crowded. Or maybe it was something that's not on this chart at all. Maybe they just had better nutrition. The British Army had better supplies. They had more vitamins, more fruit, better blankets. We don't know. Now, of course, we understand germ theory. Of course, we understand that you should not have dead dogs in your water supply. But all Nightingale had to go on was a hunch and the data. And when you look at the data presented like this, you think to yourself, maybe she's not right at all. Let's go back one more time to the Rose diagram. Exactly the same data. And the story is so much stronger. There is no other possible explanation. It must have been the Sanitary Commission showed up between March, which is the last wedge of diagram 1, and April, the first wedge of diagram 2. Okay, enough graphs. I don't know how to feel about this. I know that Florence Nightingale was right. I know that her campaigning for improved public health in the UK saved countless lives. You could see life expectancy rising dramatically in Victorian England from around 1860. Public health laws were signed into operation. The military changed the way they organized barracks. The medical profession changed their practice. And John Simon, the chief medical officer, very gradually, very subtly walked back his earlier statement. Remember, he'd said that deaths from infectious diseases were practically speaking unavoidable. he republished that same essay 30 years later in the 1880s, and he changed the words without noting that he'd changed the words, from practically speaking unavoidable to, in some degree, unavoidable. So from saying there's nothing we can do, he moved to saying, well, you can't save everybody. Florence Nightingale and her pie chart had defeated him. Now there's one more puzzle about all of this. Every time I read a biography or an essay about Florence Nightingale and her amazing data visualization work, there's this magnificent quote. And the quote is from William Farr, great statistician and partner in crime of Florence Nightingale. They work very closely together. And the letter says, you complained that your report would be dry. The drier, the better. Statistics should be the driest of all reading. And the biographers present this letter from William Farr, and they say to themselves, thank goodness she ignored him. You know, this beardy old Victorian guy saying statistics need to be the driest of all reading, and this fiery young woman, a passionate campaigner for better public health, who was the scourge of the military establishment, who basically told him, no, you're wrong. We need beautiful graphs. The beautiful graphs are not just decoration. The beautiful graphs are a communicative weapon. Well, that's what all the biographers tell you. But, well, I did a little bit of homework while I was researching how to make the world add up, which I mentioned, by the way, it's out tomorrow. Do pick up a copy. What I found doing the homework was that William Farr never wrote to Florence Nightingale saying statistics should be the driest of all reading. She wrote those words to him. And because the copy of the letter that we have is unsigned, somebody obviously found it somewhere in the archives, misunderstood who had sent the letter to whom, put it down in a biographical essay, and the error has been repeated ever since. But there is no doubt the letter is from the desk of Florence Nightingale, sent to William Farr. She was telling him to play it straight and to express statistics in the driest all possible terms. I think the reason people have found the mistake so plausible is a sort of a bit of inverted sexism. Like, you know, they think of the crusty old guy as being the one who would say everything would be dry. And they think of this dramatic feminist hero as the one who knows better. But actually the dramatic feminist hero, she was the one saying, keep the statistics dry. So how do we square that discovery with the fact that Florence Nightingale created this incredibly dramatic, incredibly bold, and very slightly naughty pie chart with which she started, and I would say finished, a public health revolution? How do we square those two things? I think Florence Nightingale understood that she would face enemies. She was told that she would face enemies. Those enemies would criticize her data. They would find every way they could to attack her. And therefore, if she was going to do these amazing acrobatic flourishes of statistical rhetoric, she needed the foundations to be absolutely solid. That's what she was saying, I think, to William Farr. Let's get the facts absolutely right. Let's make it completely unimpeachable. Once we have the facts, then draw all the pretty pictures you like and see where we go. And I was thinking about that insight while I was watching Sir Patrick Vallance presenting a graph last autumn. And some of you may remember this. It showed what was called a projection, not a forecast. It showed a projection of what would happen if cases increased from this very low level last September, but if they doubled every 7 days. And, for 7 days, for 14 days, you don't have much. But after a couple of months, cases are completely out of control. So he presented this graph and everyone made a big old fuss. And they said, well, cases aren't doubling every 7 days. And this is scaremongering. And why are you trying to terrify everybody? And why do you experts keep wanting to ruin Christmas? And I was asked to go on the Today program to comment on this. And I said, well, yeah, he has slightly overcooked that. It's not doubling every 7 days. The data suggest that cases are doubling every 8 or 9 days, which makes a difference, but maybe not that much of a difference. And as we look back at the 150,000 people who've lost their lives in this pandemic, the majority of them, since that graph was shown, the majority of them since a vaccine was approved for use, I realized Sir Patrick was telling us something. And maybe we should have listened. But he pushed it just a little bit too far. Took his eyes off making those underlying statistics the driest of all reading. And he just gave a little bit of ammunition to his enemies. And they were very, very quick to fire and to mock him and to tell everybody that he didn't know what he was talking about. And I wish Florence Nightingale had been there to whisper in his ear, you just get the facts, absolutely rock solid. Leave the graphs to me. Might have been in a different place. Thanks very much for listening. I'm very happy to take questions, and I hope you've got a few.
Thank you very much, Tim. So, as Tim said, we are now open to questions. So if you'd like to ask Tim a question, please can you type it into the chat box, use the send to everyone option, and we can go through some questions. So please do that. Thank you. I'd quite like to ask a question actually while we're waiting for people to kick off, if that's okay. Tim, was there a reason for, or a main motivating factor behind you starting the book? You mentioned your new book, How to Make the World Add Up. Was there a main sort of factor why you decided you wanted to write that book now?
Absolutely. There were really two things. I've been presenting more or less on Radio 4 and the World Service for about 15 years. And we've always been playing with the numbers and examining statistical claims that are made by politicians or charities or ice cream manufacturers or journalists or anybody really, and just having fun and trying to help people understand the world. But a lot of that has involved taking down statistical falsehoods and saying, yeah, this politician hasn't told us the truth, or this charity has got way too excited about something, and don't take their claims too seriously. And I realized that a lot of people were interpreting more or less as purely debunking. Like all we did was show how statistics were used to lie. And as I became aware of that, I thought, we're making a terrible mistake, because statistics are this incredibly powerful tool for understanding the world. The statistics are what helped Florence Nightingale understand what was happening in the hospitals in Scutari. Statistics have helped us track the pandemic, understand how dangerous COVID is, how it spreads, who is most at risk. They've helped us evaluate the cures. Statistics are not just a vector for political argument. They're not just about politicians trying to win elections or trying to deceive us about their record. They're about trying to understand the world. So I really, really wanted to get that point across in How to Make the World Add Up. The second thing that I thought was incredibly important to do was to be realistic about the fact that a lot of what we believe, we don't believe because of the evidence. We believe because we want to believe. We believe because of our political preconceptions, our tribalism. We believe because we're not paying enough attention. It just scrolls past on Twitter or Instagram and who cares? We believe because of emotional reasons. And all of those things had to be addressed. I can't write a book that says, here's a bunch of technical information about statistics, unless I deal with the emotional and the psychological elements too. So How to Make the World Add Up is supposed to be a book that helps people understand the world around them, helps people be curious and ask the right questions. It's not technical, and it's mostly not about debunking false statistics. It's about thinking clearly about the world all around us.
Thank you. We have a message here from Elizabeth. Great lecture, thank you. One of the critical issues is how to define what is counted. How do you think that we should strive to understand the definitions without losing the point?
That's a superb question. Florence Nightingale would have approved as well. So some of her earliest statistical work was about trying to standardize definitions of illnesses. So one of the things you might want to do as a public health statistician is to say, well, how does one hospital compare with another hospital? Or is there an outbreak of a disease in a particular part of a city? And you can't do that unless you're actually categorizing illnesses in a consistent way. And this was something she was really interested in. William Farr, her long-term intellectual partner, was really interested in. So this goes way back. But Elizabeth's absolutely right. In general, it's very easy to misunderstand a statistic because you've misunderstood a definition. And sometimes that's because the definition is not a very good definition. Sometimes it's because it's the best the statisticians could do, but we've leapt to conclusions. I actually call this in the book, I call this premature enumeration. So we're slicing and dicing, we're taking averages, we're asking whether the number's going up or down. We don't actually understand what's being measured. So just to give you a quick example of that, if you imagine a newspaper report that says, oh, scientists have looked at video games and they find that violent video games increase violence or maybe reduce violence, because you see both of these kind of reports cited. That's fine, but you need to understand, okay, what do you mean by violent video games? Does Pac-Man count? I mean, Pac-Man eats sentient creatures. It's pretty violent, but it's probably not what they meant. What do you mean by, like, presumably they don't cause any problems just sitting on the shelf or on a hard drive. They have to be played. So how much do you have to play them to see this effect? Did somebody play it for 20 minutes in a lab, or does somebody play for 20 hours a week? When you say cause violent behavior, is that somebody filled in some questionnaire, or is it that we actually saw a correlation out in the world, people being more likely to get in trouble with the police? When psychologists are investigating aggression, they often use something called the hot sauce paradigm, which is basically how much hot sauce are you willing to add to somebody else's drink? That's a measure of aggression. I mean, there's no right or wrong way to do this. Well, there are some wrong ways to do this. But the point is there are lots of different ways to try to get at an answer to that question. There's no perfect way. And if we're trying to understand what the scientists actually found, we need to show a little bit of curiosity as to what they actually did. And if the journalist who's writing up the experiment is doing a good job, we'll have that curiosity satisfied. If the journalist isn't doing a good job, we'll just get some vague claim about boffins discover this. And you realize, actually, I have no idea what they actually did and whether I should believe it or not as a result.
Thank you. Okay, we have a message here from Andy. Hi, Tim. The government said it's following the science in relation to COVID. What is the likelihood that the government will follow the science in other policy areas, e.g. health inequalities?
Yeah, it's a nice thing for governments to say. And I think to some extent it's been true, and to some extent it's an absurd thing to say, right? I mean, because there is no such thing as the science. There is just what we learn from looking at the evidence, what scientists believe, and what scientists believe differs between scientists, and it will evolve over time as new evidence comes in. I think it is interesting to note that there are certain sort of parts of politics and policy making that are inevitably ideologically polarized. And there are other parts where people just say, well, that's for the boffins, figure that one out. So, for example, if a politician says, I'm going to make the trains run on time, of course, it's a long history of politicians making that sort of claim. In the end, you leave the design of the tracks to an engineer. You leave the design of the scheduling to somebody who understands train scheduling, et cetera, et cetera. There's a certain point where you hand over to the technical people. But for some reason, politicians are very, very willing to engage in certain parts of policymaking, and they just assume that expertise tells you nothing. And at other times, they will let the technocrats have free rein. And of course, the technocrats are not always right, but I tend to feel that the technocrats are likely to do a better job generally than politicians in a lot of these areas. It's interesting to reflect on this in the case of vaccines. So it's not just the politicians, but we ourselves tend to form views that can either be evidence-based or based on something else. So if you look in the States, before we had COVID vaccines, there were vaccines for HPV, human papilloma virus, and HBV, hepatitis B virus. And the HBV vaccine, people would just take if their doctor recommended it. The HPV vaccine became very highly politicized, and you basically had a Republican attitude to the vaccine, and you had a Democrat attitude to the vaccine. There's nothing fundamental about people, and there's nothing fundamental about vaccines that creates these situations. Some of this stuff is deliberately ideologically polarized, and some is not. It's quite interesting to see now in the US, vaccines appear to be, again, COVID vaccines are politically and ideologically polarized. Some people have found it profitable to do that. And here in the UK, they're not. There's no serious political party saying, don't take the vaccine because Boris or something like that, thankfully.
Julia has a question. Thank you, that was great. Is there a danger that the balance of public communication is shifting too much towards emotion and away from facts? Is this already happening?
It's certainly happening. I'm not sure that it's new. I think it's intriguing to reflect on how the modern media ecosystem deals with this, social media being the most obvious change. It's never been easier to make a real knee-jerk decision based on an emotional reaction. It's never been easier to follow only the people you want to follow and ignore or block all the people you want to ignore or block. At the same time, it's never been easier to go really deep and to find really smart people, real experts on any particular subject, go and look at the data yourself. I mean, 20 years ago, when I first started nerding around with economic data, it would come on a CD every year from the World Bank. And you'd try and get hold of this CD if you could. And then at the end of the year, you'd throw the CD away and you'd get more data on a new CD. And at a certain point, all this stuff becomes publicly available, much easier to use, much easier to access. So I worry about the same thing that you do, about people making decisions based on their emotions, based on their gut feeling. But it is partly about whether we want to access the facts. Because if we're curious and we're open-minded and we want to know, it's all out there. It's never been easier to find. So one of the things that I encourage people to do in my writing and in my broadcasting is go another click, ask a couple more questions, have a little bit of humility, but also enough self-confidence in yourself to know that you can actually go and get a second opinion and a third opinion. You don't have to believe whatever this particular sort of political flag wearer is telling you.
Thank you. A question from Nikki. Is big data a help or a hindrance in how statistics is developing as a science?
So big data is potentially a huge deal, potentially very, very useful. Big data means different things to different people, but I think that a useful category of big data is what you might call found data. So this is just all the exhaust that comes out of our credit card use, our phone use, um, and web searches and so on. And it's been put to very good use in the pandemic. For example, we've been able to track what's been happening to the economy from just looking at how people are moving around. And we can track how people are moving around because we've got data from Android phones. The Google mobility data is out there. And it would have been hard to imagine that sort of data source 20 years ago. So that's a really valuable source of data. And a second potentially valuable source of data is what's called administrative data. So administrative data is all the stuff that used to be on kind of filing cards in big filing cabinets somewhere, and now is on computers. So your passport details, your driving license details, but also things like you've opened a Netflix account. Okay, so Netflix need to know where you live and where your computer is and what your credit card number is. And Amazon need to know those things, et cetera, et cetera. So lots and lots of organizations who have this data that they gather because that's what they need to do business. But the data can also be repurposed to understand the world around us, understand what's going on. So that's the promise. I think that those certain dangers are absolutely obvious to privacy, for example, these huge companies and what do they know about us. But I think there are some less obvious dangers. In the book, I argue that it's really useful to go back to about 1660. In 1660s, this moment in European science where alchemy is still very widely practiced. So people like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, and Isaac Newton, very prominent alchemists. At the same time, chemistry is coming into its own. You've got these two rival schemes of knowledge, alchemy and chemistry. In principle, they're trying to do basically the same thing, trying to understand the behavior of materials and achieve material change. You've got the same people involved. Isaac Newton is the top scientist and also the top alchemist. You've got the same methods. So people doing experiments and trying to learn from experiments. And yet alchemy goes absolutely nowhere and chemistry becomes, well, modern chemistry. And the difference, I think, is to do with transparency, to do with norms of sharing and collaboration and checking out each other's work. So at this time, Marin Mersenne, the mathematical monk, that's sometimes called the postbox of Europe, he's holding intellectual court in France, and he is at this network hub, scientists writing to him from all over Western Europe, and he's copying out the letters, and he's posting them onto other letters. So Descartes might discover something that Newton's doing, or Leibniz, or all of these people, all connected to each other, particularly through Mersenne. And those norms go on to mean the setting up of the Royal Society and the similar scientific societies in France. All about collaboration, all about openness. If someone does an experiment, you can do the same experiment. You can check to see if you get the same result. That was the difference between science and alchemy, because all of the alchemy was being done in secret. People wouldn't share their results, because why would you share your results? Because you're trying to turn lead into gold. And if you figure out how to do that, you don't want anybody else to know the trick. So Isaac Newton actually wrote to another alchemist and said, you must maintain high silence. Don't reveal the secrets. And of course, alchemists were also hampered by the fact that they assumed that previous alchemists had discovered these secrets but hadn't shared them. So these problems had all been solved and they had to be solved all over again. Of course, none of these problems were ever solved. Okay, what's that got to do with modern algorithms? Well, when you think about the way Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, the way they hold these big data sets, the decision-making they're doing with them, it's very like alchemy. They're not sharing. Why are they not sharing? They're not sharing because there's money to be made. And so while there's a big difference between alchemy and big data analysis, the transparency norms, the collaboration norms are very similar. Now, why is this a problem? Well, let me remind you of what happened about 10 months ago. Every GCSE student in the country, including some I know quite well, was assigned, and the A-level students as well, was assigned grades based on an algorithm. And this algorithm, we were just told, well, don't worry, the algorithm will sort it all out. There's no oversight. There's no independent review. There's no idea of like, what grades make sense. Is it even possible to do what the people who designed the algorithm said they could do? The answer is, of course, it is not, in fact, possible to do it. There's no algorithm that can do that. But we didn't have the oversight. And so we had this very distressing day or two. And then, of course, the whole thing was just reversed. There's this complete public outcry. I think that shows what happens when you've got politicians who are looking for easy answers, meet people selling snake oil who say that algorithms can solve their problems, and you've got no oversight whatsoever. So we don't know whether the algorithms work. We don't know whether all this big data analysis is actually delivering results. It's not just the A-levels. People go to prison or not based on algorithms that purport to be able to predict whether they're going to reoffend. Do these algorithms work? Does the big data deliver the insights that it promises to? We don't know. We don't know because none of this stuff is publicly available. So you need painstaking investigative journalism to even work out what the algorithm is doing. And then once you can work out what the algorithm is doing, you can start to ask questions as to whether it's doing it well or not. So I'm very excited about the potential, but I think we really need to change the way that we do things if we're going to really unlock the insights that are potentially available.
Thank you. We have a couple of final questions. First of all, from Chris. Do you think increasing use of AI will help the cause you espouse or hinder it, e.g. by removing humans yet further from the data, definitions and premises, etc., and getting their hands actually dirty?
So I think a lot of what I've just said is relevant to that answer, but it's a very interesting question as to how humans and artificial intelligence interact and the decisions that we make. And I think very often we have this model in mind that the AI will make the decisions, and then if there's a problem, it gets kicked to a human. And that can work. But the problem that you get, because this sort of system is used in self-driving cars, autopilots for planes, the problem you get is that as the AI gets better and better, the humans get less and less practice, and the conditions in which you ask the humans to take over are more and more confusing, bewildering, and unusual. And as a result, planes generally fly incredibly safely, but when they do crash, they usually crash with an incredibly bewildered pilot at the controls. Now, he's just not used to flying a plane by himself or herself. There's an alternative model, which is to say, have the human fly the plane, have the human drive the car, and have the AI watching over them, learning from them, and the AI takes over if there's a problem, which is less convenient, but makes a lot of sense to me for autopilot systems, because artificial intelligence doesn't get bored, doesn't get tired, and humans do get bored and tired. So I have this in mind as a mental model when I think about all of the things that we could be asking AI to do for us, like recommend blog posts or select books to read. But the question as to when to switch off the algorithm and to trust your judgment and vice versa is, I think, one that I would like to understand better. And I've not seen any really good answers to it yet.
We have a lovely question from Miriam in Year 5, which I think brings us around to the beginning very nicely. She says, how long did it take for people to listen to Florence Nightingale once she made her chart?
Oh, it's a really good question. By the way, Miriam, I'm thinking of doing a version of how to make the world add up for people about your age. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts if you have a chance to look at the book, or just email me with thoughts after this lecture, because I think the story of Florence Nightingale is something that people in Year 5 might be intrigued by. How long did it take for her to be heard? I've simplified in my lecture a long process. So There were a series of inquiries. It was a gradual series of victories. Certain different public health acts were passed. I mean, I suppose you could say it took 30 years for John Simon to change his mind, but I think that the battle was won sooner than that. But it was a long slog, and she could easily have died before it was finished. But of course, she lived to the age of 90, so she saw everything come through. But these things do take time. It's very unusual for an argument to be just won overnight. Whatever it is that you're arguing for, whether it's greater equality, whether it's action on climate change, or whether, as in Florence Nightingale's case, it was action on public health and action on the professionalization of nursing. These things take a long time, but battles that are worth fighting for decades, and she did.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for all the wonderful questions that have come in. We're now going to go over to the headmistress, Marina Gardner-Legg, who's going to round off this evening.
Tim, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you enormously, not just for giving me top tips for my next parent letter, which clearly only needs a graph and absolutely no commentary on my behalf, but also for your generosity in tonight. You've shared a wonderful, compelling story and demonstrated very much the same skills as Florence Nightingale did, if I may say so, by demonstrating the graph and also using it to tell a compelling and interesting story. I also love the way that so much of what you have said absolutely combines with the key messages of Oxford High. And I know you're aware of this, which is spirited young people who are exceptionally curious and the key message of approaching everything that you're presented with a critical mind and a sense of integrity and mission to make the world a better place. And everything you've said tonight absolutely demonstrates that. About 2 months ago, I would have said thank you for being with us, being very aware that you didn't have anything else particularly to do. But tonight, I know it's a real choice, and you have shared your knowledge and your questions and the answers so generously. And I appreciate it enormously on behalf of everybody here. And thank you everybody else who's here tonight for joining us as well. And if I may just illustrate my story with a little graphic, don't forget it's out tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you everybody so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Good evening.
Goodbye.